So basically when you open it, the first thing you're going to see are these squares. And inside these squares you have some different objects. Did I mess this up already? No. Okay. So you have instructions in this template, right, for each of these squares. And each of these instructions correspond to the squares. So you could literally walk through and read this and pretty much find your way through the template and teach yourself. The idea today is that I'm going to be talking and walking you through these steps, and you guys can follow along. If you get lost, you have these steps to reference, and you're also going to have the video at the end. So just let me know whenever you guys are there. Anyone not have this open?
Opening right now.
Does anybody have it open so I can just check to make sure you're in the right spot? Yeah, that's fine. So let me just. There is one error on this. Okay.
No, open the you just sent. So download this one and download this one. So which one do we open?
The workshop, my modeling workshop. Modeling. Okay. Same. Opening. Okay. Okay. So really quickly, there is one error on this, and I realized that save. Okay. So this one should be like this.
It's updating right now.
So if you
So what was the key that you pressed in order to center the view?
F. Everyone set? Anyone not there yet?
I'm not there.
Okay, no, I can wait. We have time. I don't want to rush through this one. So I was going to try to combine animation in this one too, but we'll see how far we get. I didn't have time to make an animation template, but I think what I can do is I can show you the steps and then make a template over the weekend and send it to you. The idea for this is what I want you guys to do with this. So I know I showed a couple of you guys, but I think what the idea is that we want to create really simple diagrams to combine our site analysis, our environmental analysis, and explain in a very simple diagram how that's influencing the building form of our project and ultimately our project. A good example, Zaha Hadid has some really good examples, but Big I think has the cleanest ones that are really easy to understand. I'm not saying you have to do the same style. You guys can pick whatever style you want, but these are good because they are pretty readable. But the idea is that once we're going to start with getting these diagrams modeled in 3D, once we have them modeled in 3D, we can then translate them into animations. And then we can play them. You guys can either create videos, we can use augmented reality or projection mapping to display some of these animations. The internet is super slow today. It's always around studio time, right? If the internet crashes. And also, Maya is really good for conceptual modeling. So you can make really complex forms super fast, and you can then bring those into a different program and rationalize it later. Wow, this is terrible. Okay. So for example, I'm not sure what's going to be a good example, but let's try this one. So this is a pier for St. Petersburg. I'm not sure if they have diagrams. So like this would be like some of their diagrams, right? Simple concept, to explain their concept, and then basically showing different vectors and lines of how they go through and would do that, right? So these are some iterations showing like how different forms can do different things. These are the different options that they thought about. This one probably isn't the best example, but because they're not really taking into so much the site context because they're in water, right? But basically the idea is that you're showing really simple different vectors and lines of how something would be designed. Let's try. I think this one was a good one. So they're taking into account the elevation and slope. It's almost like a comic in a way too. So they're adjusting the slope, right? Looking at the site. So then they start, hey, how you doing? So then they start looking at the site context and seeing how they can start to change this form based off of programmatic needs for the site. Rotating them. And basically a very simple process of how they get to their final building form. But I want you guys to do something a little bit more complex where you're going to be looking at the environmental analysis as well as the site conditions at the same time. So if you actually started doing, so like in this case, they're like showing that they're trying to adjust this to take into account the axis from this building, and then focusing on views. So I mean, a lot of times I think we do these diagrams, we're not really critical about what we're really trying to show, and I think what we want to do is really be critical about what we're trying to show and show it visually in the simplest way as possible. So that's kind of the idea. But we want to take it one step further and actually turn these into animations. So you guys can go on this website and look through some of the projects and see how they diagram those. So Grant, when you get a chance, just download this file from Slack and get started. Okay, so everyone has their file open? Everyone's good now? Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at, in Maya, you always start with a primitive. There's two different ways of working. So the idea is that I'm showing you all the commands that are most important for an architectural modeling workflow. And you can either use planes and surfaces and start modeling that way, or in this case, we can use a primitive. Anyone know what a primitive is? So a primitive is kind of like it's a geometry, typically a polysurface, but it doesn't have to be a polysurface, that's pre-generated in the software. So these are things like cubes, spheres, pyramids, whatever they may be. Basically, it's already built into the software. So if you just walk through the steps here, we have creating primitives is the title. And so we look at create. So you can go up to the create tab. We then go down to polygon primitives, and we're going to select cube. So the idea is that when you do that, you're going to see the object on the right is going to be what you want to see. Like if you completed this template, then you're going to see the same thing, right? So if you hit create polygon primitives cube, you're going to get this cube, which matches this one. Make sense? Everyone got that far? Yeah? Okay, so the next thing you want to do after you start with the cube, mind you, I'm working in the perspective mode. Does everyone have one view open, or do you have multiple? You have one? Okay, good. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to select components. So in Maya, you have two different types of selection. You can either select an object, which will highlight green, or you can select components. To select the components, you just have to select the object, and then by right-clicking on the mouse and holding that mouse down, you're going to get these different options. So we have edge, we have vertex, and we have faces. And there's some other options too, like we can go back to object mode. In this case, let's go ahead and choose vertex. You guys remember what a vertex is? Yeah? So we get it turns blue, and then we get the vertexes highlighted. So what I want you guys to do is to try to basically copy this form. So the way that I did that, make sure your snap grid is on. I'm going to move this bottom left one. I'm going to move it up 1, 2, 3 grid points, and then out 1 to the left.
Which file is it, the first one?
Yeah, it's Maya Basic Modeling Workshop template, AlbertElias. And then I'm going to move this top one, the same thing, 3 back. 1, 2, 3, right? And then this bottom one over here, I'm going to move out just 1, right? And I think this one I moved back 2. So something like this. This one also has this push back, right? So in this case, if I have two of the vertices that are aligned, I can either select both of them, right, by clicking one and then shift and clicking the other, or I could right click again and then pick edge, right? So now I picked edge, and now I've copied that form. Everyone's okay with that so far? Anyone not do that yet?
So this is all based off a cube?
Yeah, we start,
Push and pull it.
exactly. So if you have the grid snap on, you can get exactly this form. Grid snap is up here at the top. So if I turn that off, then when I move something, it'll move like more smooth. But if I have grid snap on, it'll snap to the grid.
What if you want to create like voids and stuff? Like let's say you want to cut like down there, open it up.
We'll get there. Yeah. Everyone's okay with this so far? Okay.
How do you make the grid show? Because I have it on, but it's not showing.
There's this little icon here, which has the grid. The grid will only show on for just this part. I think you can change the size of it, but it's not really important. That's just it's okay, it doesn't matter. It's because of the setting. So if you look down here, in the right bottom left corner, you have Y in this case is up, X is to the right, and Z is forward or backwards. Maya is typically different than Rhino and other programs where I think typically and by default the Z is up. It's one or the other, but basically you can switch that in your settings. You can go to settings, preferences, and then you can switch under the settings from up axis to being Y to Z. So I might have just changed it. But it's not really important for this. You can just hide it and you'll still be fine. If you want the background in mine is black. So if you want to change that, you can hit hold Alt and hit B. And you have a few options to choose from.
How do you get onto just one page? Like how do you just get onto
So if you have 4 pages, if you hit the space bar, it'll take you to 4. If you want to, so we're working in the perspective mode, so just put your mouse over perspective and then hit spacebar.
Then how do you orbit it?
I mean, if you haven't watched the videos that I sent, just you're going to struggle a lot with this. Orbiting is Alt, and then you're going to click the left mouse button, and you can rotate. Pan is going to be Alt, and then middle mouse button, and then drag. It might be really hard for you to follow if like you've never used it before. So I mean, we're recording this, so you can go back and watch it later, because it'll probably take us way too long if we focus on all of the stuff. So the next thing I want to explain to you guys, so you guys understand, we went over how to create a primitive, right? You're going to start with the cube. We know how to modify that cube between faces or edges and vertices. You could also select faces, right? So right click and face, and you can move a face as well. Simple enough. The next thing we're going to talk about is high poly versus low poly. So in Maya, everything starts off pretty much, except for maybe like pretty much every primitive is going to start off as low poly. And then what Maya has, it has something called smoothing, right? I think it's like a Catmull algorithm. Somebody invented this algorithm that basically will round off sharp edges. So this does an approximation that will then take this object and smooth through some kind of math algorithm. It'll smooth out this object in order to get it to represent something like this. So this is really the premise of how you get really nice curves in Maya. You're always modeling and working in low poly mode, and you're manipulating it here, and then you're going to be constantly checking this smooth poly preview. Keep in mind when you make this preview, it's just a preview. It's not actually baked into the geometry, kind of how Grasshopper is. In order to actually bake that, so when you export it, it stays that way, you have to do it other processes. But just keep in mind that this is low poly and this is high poly. So to change from low poly is 1 on your keyboard. If you select the object and press 3, it'll then turn it into the high poly form, right? And if you want to switch it back, you're going to press 1. Okay. The next step is edge loops. So if we want to get this object, well, I forgot to delete the edge loops. I'm sorry. So let's go ahead and delete them, and then we can talk about an important concept. So if you right-click and select edge, everything's going to turn blue. where the arrows are, where it says here and here, go ahead and double click on that edge. So when you create edge loops, they're kind of grouped in a way that if I select one of them, the whole loop will get highlighted. So right now I have one selected, but if I double click that loop, I should get the whole edge loop. In this case, these are not edge loops, right? Because they don't select everything, but these ones are, so I can select the whole thing. So go ahead and delete that one, and go ahead and delete this one. So double click and delete. Now, before we actually add them back, what I want to show you is that if you right click and go back into object mode, and then you press 3, you probably can't tell the difference completely, but let me just duplicate this over. So if you see these two, you see how this one is like more lumpy than this one, right? So what happened is that even though we deleted the edge loops, the vertices stay. So sometimes when you're working with Maya and you're creating loops and you're adding edges, you're going to want to make sure that when you delete them, that you also delete the vertices. So for example, if I go into vertex mode, you're going to notice even though I deleted those edge loops, those vertices are still there. So what's really cool is that you can just select everything, all the vertices, they'll all get highlighted yellow, and you can hit delete. So now when I go back, I have a clean geometry. So it's really important in Maya to always keep a clean geometry to make sure that when you do smooth it, it's going to smooth in the way that you want it to. Okay?
Select it and hit what?
You would select all of them and delete. And what it's going to do is that if there's no edge associated with that vertex, that vertex is going to get deleted, right? So what I want you guys to do is we're basically going to create an edge loop. So in order to do that, you're going to go to Mesh Tools. So Mesh Tools, and then Insert Edge Loop. When you select this, then it's going to ask you to, it's going to wait for you to select an edge on your object. So I have these two arrows that say add here and add here. So you can click, and before you finish it, you can just basically drag exactly where you want it to be, right? So in this case, we're not getting an edge loop, so I think there's something wrong with my geometry. Maybe we still have, because I undid. Make sure you delete all of your edges. I missed an edge. Okay, so Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop, right? And I'm going to put one here, right? So now when I hit, so you're going to notice that with Maya, the more geometry you add, the more you can control the shape, right? So basically, by adding those two edge loops, I went from something that was maybe really rounded, something really round, and by adding the edge loops, it starts to sharpen out those edges. So the way that this works, if I'm in mode 3 and I add an edge loop, the closer I bring the edge loop to another edge, the sharper it's going to be, right? So like if I had a roof and I wanted it to be flat, I just bring the edge as close to the roof as possible. Same thing for the ground. I mean, it's kind of flat already. So let's say if I wanted to, right? The closer I bring the edges to another edge, the tighter or the sharper the object is going to be. So this is how you can really get like this kind of combination of smooth and sharp geometry, right? Any questions on that? Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is extruding, right? So to extrude, you're going to right click. You're going to select the face. Select the face. So I selected these two faces. And then you can either go to Edit Mesh, Extrude, or you can hit Control E on the keyboard. Control E. You're going to get this new kind of gizmo, which is going to also pop up some options over here, which we'll talk about later. But if you just go ahead and just drag it out once, one point, and then maybe up 1. That's fine. You'll get somewhere close to this shape. And then again, we can hit 3, and we can smooth that out. Okay? Any questions on extrude? Is this super simple for you guys? Because, okay. So next, what I want to show you is duplicate. So for example, you can select this, and if you go to edit, you have 2 different types of duplicate. Duplicate, you could either do Control D, which will just create a copy, and you can drag that over. There's also duplicate special. So what duplicate special will do is, let's say if I was to go to edit, duplicate special, and then I start modifying this, maybe rotating it, maybe scaling it, and then I was to repeat that again. It's not duplicate special, it's duplicate transform. It's shift duplicate with transform. So shift D or edit duplicate with transform. Shift D. If I move this and I rotate it and I scale it, I could keep hitting shift D and it's gonna continue. It's gonna do the same logic, but remember that transform, right? So this is a really fast way that you can get kind of parametric results based off of really simple geometry instead of rules, and then you can manipulate that. So duplicate or duplicate special or duplicate with transform.
What's that one you used to make it like that?
So I did duplicate with transform.
You have to highlight the whole thing?
Just the one that you want to copy.
And then you just move it.
So I'll do it again. So if you select the object, you're going to hit Shift D. You're going to move it aside. Maybe rotate it. Maybe scale it. Maybe you can see it one direction. Maybe rotate it again. And then just hit Shift D. Right? This can really rapidly get heavy, so be careful when you do this. But one thing so the next thing I want to show you guys is combine. So right now we've been working with one geometry, but you can combine objects even though they're separate into one object. So if you have 2, we can go up to mesh, combine, and now these are one geometry even though they're separate, right? So that means I can go over here to this object, and I can go to mesh, combine, and make it one object. So now when I do Shift D, right, I can treat this whole thing as a, right, so I get an even more complex geometry, right? I mean, that can get super out of control really fast. So, I mean, I don't recommend that, but that is possible by repeating the same. So again, I can select these and I can smooth them out, right? So I'm just going to delete them for now. The reason why we want to combine geometry is for bridging. So if you have these 2 geometries, we're going to first do mesh combine. We're then going to jump into selecting a face. And then what we can do is we can select these 2 faces, and we can go to edit mesh bridge, right? And now they're combined. So when you bridge something, you get this little pop-up that shows up on the side where you can add more divisions, right? So let's just say we add 3 divisions. You can also change the curve type. It starts off as linear by default, but you can switch it to blend. So blend is going to try to basically follow the tangents of those faces. And then you also have curve, which I'm not exactly sure how curve calculates it, but typically I use either blend or linear, right? And then you also have if you're using blend, you have a taper or a twist. So you can make this taper further down, and you can also cause it to twist, right? And again, once we are happy with that, we can hit 3, right? And then we have the smooth version. So you're always working in 1 and then always checking the result in 3, right? So like if I like this line that's going from this edge all the way to this edge and I want to really accent it, you can create an edge loop and put it really close to that edge. And then when you hit 3, you notice that you kind of can see that sharper edge, right? So it's always constantly like going back and forth and checking, like where do you want to have sharp edges and where do you want it to be round, smooth, right? Okay. The next thing I want to show you is that once you start getting complex geometry, you can continue to play with form by using mirroring. So you could select this object, and then if you go to Mesh, and you go to Mirror, so by default, it's going to set the axis position to world. That's world space, but we don't want world space, we want object space. So you're going to select Object, and then you have this option for axis. The default is X, so I can move this along the X axis and I can kind of start to see different options, right? So this is really good for like testing out different building forms rapidly, creating iterations. I can switch this to, let's say, Y. So now my axis is in the Y direction, right? Or you can also do Z. You can also rotate this, so you can start to get some really interesting results as you change this. Right, so really quickly you can start to get kind of really crazy results. If you get something like this where you push the geometry past its limit, it can't fill it, you can try switching from merge border to bridge border, and maybe you might get a different result, right? But the default merge is probably fine for most cases. Any questions on this so far? Again, you can then smooth it out. You can then take it and do the same thing again. So if I hit G on the keyboard, it's going to repeat the last command, so I don't have to type it again. So I hit G, switch it to Object, and now I'm mirroring what I already mirrored, right? And you can kind of keep going with this, and you can really quickly start to get complex geometries. I think the idea when you're doing this kind of a workflow, though, is you want to try to avoid a total symmetry, and you want to try to find ways to break up that and make it not so perfectly symmetrical. I think that's when you start to get more interesting results. Right? Any questions on this so far? These are the major commands you'll use to model. So let's say if I was to go and start with the cube, so I'm going to go edit mesh or create polygon primitive cube. And I'm going to move this cube away from all this. If you hit F on the keyboard, it'll zoom you in to that cube. And what you can do is you can right click and select face. And then I can hit Control E for extrude. And I can just start extruding, right? So I can start to kind of build geometry this way too. Right? And you can always smooth it, and then you can add edge loops if you want. Mesh tools, insert edge loop. So maybe I'll make the bottom and top flatter. maybe make the bottom edge wider.
So is that Control W?
Yeah, so I'm switching, sorry, I forgot to mention that. I'm switching between W, E, and R. So W is move, E is rotate, R is scale. Right, so I can start to control these different parts. So one thing that right, what else? So you can also do that same thing, and instead of extruding one by one, if you wanted to have more of a form that's following some kind of path, you could have a curve. So if I go to create curve tools, and I'm just going to pick a CV curve, and I'm just going to go ahead and draw that curve in. Actually, I'm not going to use a CV curve. I'm going to do create EP curve, so I can get more of a smooth curve, and hit enter. So what I can do is that if I create a cube, I'll button curvative cube, and I go ahead and I align that cube with the start of that curve. I can select this face, and then with shift selected, select the curve. So I have to be in object mode. So select the curve first, then right click, go into face mode and select the face, holding shift down. And with both selected, I can then extrude. And it looks like it just goes to the end, but if you add the divisions, you're going to notice that it's going to follow this curve, right? So very quickly, if you have curves that you've drawn out or sketched in Rhino or another program, you can start to extrude along those curves and start to get more complex geometry, kind of like a sweep, right? In this case, you can also change the thickness, which I guess just makes it extrude further. I mean, these don't really help you too much. I guess the only one that would be helpful is if you were to offset it, right? So it could taper if you wanted to.
Could you have both, like low poly and high poly, like almost as if they were like a gradient? Is that possible?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Like let's say for that curve, it started low poly, and then towards the end, it started to become more curvilinear.
Yeah, so if you wanted to do that, so if we were in 3 right now, you would just have to control where you put the edges. So in that case, you wouldn't maybe use an edge loop, because if you add an edge loop, it's going to make the whole thing, right?
Right.
So if you wanted the other end to be smoother, what you'd have to do is go in and delete these loops at the end, which then you'll start to get a little bit of strange geometry, but you'll get that rounding back that you didn't have before. Just remember to delete the extra vertices. It's the edges that really control the sharpness, right? So it goes from something sharper to something that's round. And again, I don't think Maya is the best program for making your final form. I think it's really more about experimenting, and then you can get a conceptual design and then rationalize it in something like Grasshopper or Rhino. I think Maya is really fast to work with. So for example, I just showed you guys some basic modeling techniques, but there's a lot more complex ones. I'm going to do an exercise with the other file. Basically what I want you guys to do is I want you to try to model this building conceptually using images that I provided. So if you open up the other file, it's going to look like this. And basically these are drawings that I took from the internet of this building, and I'm going to show you guys how you can set that up, right? So what you want to do is you want to have the top view, the side, and one other view, either an elevation or a section or a side view. And what you can do is, like, if you're modeling your building like by hand, like if you're making a sketch model, you would take a picture from the front, from the top, of all the elevations. And then how you could import them is you go to, so each of these windows has this little view tab. If you click on view, you can go into image plane, import image, and go into Dropbox, sorry. Or you have to find the image, where did I put these at? Apply for search. Right, you'd find your image. And then you can press open and it'll appear. When it appears in a default mode, so then you would have to basically go in here and scale it to make sure that it matches the other elevation. So you could essentially sketch out all of your elevations, how you think that they'll look, and then try to match them, and then see how that would look in 3D. And then you guys can use this as a guide for modeling. Going back to the other one. Another really fast way that you can model in Maya, let's say if we take this form here, I'm just going to move it to the side. You can use something called soft selection, right? So if I go into component mode, I'm going to select vertex. If I select one of these vertices, I can move that one vertice, right? But let's say I want to move a couple of them, but I don't want to just move them one by one. If you press B on the keyboard, you're going to notice you get this gradient of color of the edges. And this is soft selection. So what's going to happen is everywhere that's in black is not going to move. Everywhere that's in yellow is going to move. And then there's a gradient fall off behind it. So as I start to move, you notice that these things start to follow, right? So really quickly, you can start to really generate some complex form and then maybe test this out and see what that's going to look like, right? So fair warning when you're doing this, always make sure that you're working in 1. Because for example, if I work in 3 and then I start moving this, if I go back to 1, it's not obvious here, but if you did this a million times, your geometry is going to look, it's going to be so hard to work with. You always want to make sure you're moving and altering things in low poly mode, and then it smooths it afterwards. Otherwise, it's going to get really hard and messy to work with.
Can you do that again?
Soft selection is B on the keyboard, so you just hit B, and then you get a different option, right? So if you want to change the amount of fall off, so let's say I don't want to affect the whole object, if I hit B and I press the middle mouse button, I can then change the fall off radius, right? So if I just want to do a very local area.
Are you doing by vertices?
Yeah, on vertex mode. So if I just want to do this really local area, right? I can do that. And again, I can select this whole thing. I can go into mesh and I can mirror it. And very quickly, you're starting to get some really strange things. And at any point, if you see something that you think is like worth exploring, you can select it, duplicate it off to the side, right? And then that's kind of a way to save that iteration. Now, really quickly, on the side of here, everything that we've been doing on this object gets saved as an attribute. So this is our attribute editor on the right. And it basically tells you everything about this object. So you notice we have this P cube. So we started with a cube, right? So it remembers that first object. And this is all of the transform is the area of location is in the world space. So if I switch this from 34 to 35, it's going to move to 35 in the X. As I move this, you see that all these update. So I can actually rotate here. I can say rotate 45, right? And it's going to rotate 45. So all of these attributes are basically what we did to the object. So for example, some of them are things that really aren't so important, like things that are not important to us at least. The ones that are is the transform node. Anything like adding edge loops or poly mirror that's pretty powerful because we can go back to the poly mirror at any time, and you can start to change different values of this. So right now the mirroring axis is Y. I can go back at any point and change it, right? So it kind of remembers the history, similar to how Grasshopper remembers the history, right? I can also go to, what else do we do to this? Okay, well, depending on how you copy the object, if you don't duplicate it with the duplicate special or duplicate transform, it's not going to remember everything you did to the object. So you're going to lose some of the history. Any questions on soft selection?